The fuel pier was where they kept the diesel. And that was where the screaming started. I was standing on the catwalk above Pier 2 when the first helicopter lifted off the parade ground, a quarter-mile inland. And I remember thinking the rotor wash was strange because the wind was already wrong that night, coming off the water instead of toward it. On a base like Calder Point, the wind has a schedule. It comes off the land in the evening as the ground cools, pushing the smell of cut grass and asphalt out over the bay, and it turns around again before dawn. That night, it had turned early and turned hard, and the diesel stink off the fuel pier was blowing inland past me instead of out to sea. And a man who has spent his life around machines learns to trust the small wrongnesses before the large ones arrive. My name is Chief Vance, and for 19 years, I was the senior gas turbine systems mechanic aboard a guided missile destroyer, which is a long way of saying I knew exactly what every machine on that base should sound like. And right then, nothing sounded right. The base alarm wasn't the general quarters tone. It wasn't fire. It wasn't the man overboard sequence. It was the chemical attack warning, the one they tested twice a year and then apologized for testing. And underneath it, I could hear the loudspeakers up by the headquarters building giving an evacuation order that named ranks. Not sections, not divisions, ranks. Flag officers to the airfield, 06 and above to muster at Hangar 3. And not one word, not a single syllable, about the 1,100 enlisted sailors still standing on the waterfront with their hands at their sides, watching the brass climb into helicopters that had no intention of coming back. Before I take you any further into that night, I want to say thank you to the people who keep coming back to these stories. And welcome if this is your first time sitting with me. If grounded survival stories like this are your kind of thing, subscribe, leave a comment, and stay with me, because it genuinely helps the channel keep going. Now let me get back to what happened on that waterfront. The thing about a naval base is that it's built to look permanent. Concrete that's been there since before your grandfather, mooring bollards thick as oil drums, cranes the size of churches standing black against the sky. The piers themselves are old enough that you can see where they've been repaired in 3 different decades. The new pour a slightly different gray than the old. Expansion joints sealed and resealed until the whole thing is a patchwork that somehow still holds the weight of warships. You grow up around the Navy, and you start to believe the gray steel will outlast you, that the institution is a kind of weather, always there, indifferent and reliable. Something you stand inside, the way you stand inside a building during a storm. So when the loudspeakers started reading off ranks and leaving everyone else out, the first thing I felt wasn't fear. It was confusion. The specific confusion of a man watching a machine do something it was never designed to do. Evacuations have order. They have muster points and accountability, and a chain that pulls everyone along like a chain is supposed to. What I was hearing was a chain being cut, deliberately, at the link just above us. And the sound of it cutting was a recorded voice calmly reading a list that we were not on. I should tell you where I was, exactly, because it matters for everything that came after. Naval Station Calder Point sits on a spit of reclaimed land at the bottom of a deep, cold bay. 3 piers reaching out into water that never warms past 50 degrees, even in August. The whole base is a peninsula. A man-made finger of fill and rock pushed out into the bay 70 years ago, connected to the mainland by a single causeway road that runs across the marsh flats. On a clear day, you can stand at the end of Pier 1 and see the lights of the fishing town across the water, close enough to feel near and far enough to feel like another country. I'd been on the base 11 months by then, shore duty after my last sea tour. The kind of billet they give a man with my years and my back so he can finish out his time without breaking down completely. I was assigned to the intermediate maintenance facility, the big shop where they fix what the ships can't fix themselves. A cavernous building full of lathes and milling machines and overhead cranes and the smell of cutting oil and hot metal that I had come, over a long career, to find almost comforting. That night, I was working late on a salvage job. A cracked reduction gear housing off a frigate that was supposed to deploy in 3 weeks. The kind of job that doesn't care what time it is because the deployment date doesn't move. I had the night to myself. Just me and a second-class petty officer named Diaz keeping the coffee hot. When the alarms went. Diaz was 24, from a town in the Central Valley I'd never heard of. A place he described once as nothing but almond orchards and a Dairy Queen. And he had the kind of steadiness you can't train into a person. Some men get louder when things go wrong, some get faster and sloppier. Diaz got slower and quieter, narrowed down to exactly what was in front of him. And I'd noticed it the first week we worked together and made a point of keeping him close after that. While I stood there reading the loudspeaker like it was a foreign language, he was already at the shop's emergency board, pulling the laminated muster card off its hook, his face calm in the green glow of the exit sign over the door. "Chief," he said, and his voice was flat in a way that told me he'd already done the math. "That's not a drill tone. They don't run the chem warning with the evac voice. Those are 2 different systems." He was right. And the fact that a second class had spotted it before I did told me my own head was still catching up. The chemical alarm and the verbal evacuation order ran off separate networks, separate buildings, separate watchstanders. The chem alarm came from the emergency management cell. The verbal evac came from the command duty officer's console and headquarters. For both to be active at once meant either 2 simultaneous failures, 2 machines breaking in the same minute after years of working, or 2 people in 2 rooms deciding the same thing at the same time, which is not failure at all. That's coordination. That's planning. And the moment I understood it was coordination, the night changed shape for me, the way a shadow on the wall resolves into a man when your eyes adjust. Somebody knew something, and somebody had decided who got to know it, and we were on the wrong side of that decision. We went up onto the catwalk that ran along the outside of the IMF. The steel grating cold through my boots, the handrail wet with the night damp. And from up there, we could see the whole waterfront laid out below us. And that's when I saw the helicopters. 3 of them already in the air, navigation lights blinking red and green as they climbed toward the inland airfield, the heavy thud of their rotors reaching us a half-second behind the sight of them, the way it always does over distance. A 4th was winding up on the parade ground, its rotor a blurred disk catching the last of its own lights. And people were running toward it across the dark grass. I couldn't make out faces at that distance, but I could read movement, and the movement was wrong. Nobody was carrying gear. Nobody was setting up a perimeter. There were no corpsmen with litters, no security detail spreading out in a ring to cover an embarkation. No working parties hauling pallets of supplies. It was just people, a couple being a dozen of them, running for an aircraft the way you'd run for the last train out of a city that's already on fire, with their arms pumping and their heads down. Every one of them looking out for nobody but themselves. Down below us, the piers were chaos of a different kind. The duty sections from 3 ships were spilling out onto the concrete. Sailors in coveralls and watch caps, some of them still buttoning up, some with their bootlaces flapping, all of them looking the same direction we were, toward the helicopters and the headquarters building beyond. The work lights on the piers threw everything in that harsh sodium orange that drains the color out of faces and makes everyone look already sick. I could hear them yelling questions at each other, the way a crowd does when nobody has answers and everyone assumes someone nearby must have them. Where's the OOD? What's the muster point? Why is the chem alarm going? Is this real? Somebody get the duty officer. Where are the masks? And over all of it, the loudspeaker, patient and recorded and utterly indifferent, repeating its list of ranks, calling for the colonels and the captains and the admirals, and saying nothing, absolutely nothing, to the people who actually ran the base, who turned the wrenches and stood the watches and kept the whole gray machine alive. "Diaz," I said, and I had to lean close because the rotor noise was washing over us now. "Go down to the quarterdeck phone. The IMF rates a direct line to base ops. Find out what the chem reading is and where it came from." I needed a number. You can't make decisions in fog. And right then I was standing in the thickest fog of my life, surrounded by alarms and helicopters and 1,100 people about to panic, with no idea which of the dangers in front of me was real. If there was an actual chemical release somewhere on the base, the response was one thing: masks and shelter and downwind evacuation. And I knew how to do all of it. But if there wasn't, it was something else entirely. And the something else was a great deal worse, because it meant the alarm was a tool and not a warning. And a tool implies a hand, and a hand implies intent. He came back up the ladder 4 minutes later, taking the rungs 2 at a time, and his face had changed. Diaz had a good face for hiding things, a card player's face, flat and unbothered, and it had stopped hiding. There was something underneath it now that I'd never seen on him. And it took me a second to recognize it as the beginning of fear. "Lines up," he said, a little out of breath. "It rings. Nobody's answering it. I tried the duty desk, base security, the fire station. Fire station picked up." He swallowed, and his throat worked. It was an airman. Junior guy, sounded about 19. He said the whole station crew got pulled 20 minutes ago. Trucks and people, all of it. Said a master sergeant came through with a list and told everyone whose name was on it to report to Hangar 3 with a bag, and everybody else to hold their post and wait for word. He looked at me, and his voice dropped. "Chief, there's no chem reading." He checked the detector panel himself while I was on the line. "The detectors are green, all of them. Every sensor on the base reads clean air. The alarm's running on a manual override from the headquarters building. Somebody's holding it on by hand." So there it was. The fog burned off, and I could see the shape of the thing. And the shape of it was a betrayal, so clean and so deliberate that for a moment I genuinely couldn't believe a human hand had done it. That any man who'd worn the uniform could have built this and walked away from it. Somebody at the top of the base had decided to leave. And rather than tell 1,100 people the truth, whatever the truth was, they'd reached over and triggered the one alarm in the whole inventory that would make everyone freeze in place and cover their faces and not chase the helicopters. The one alarm that turns the instinct to run into the instinct to hide. The chemical alarm wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a malfunction. It was a leash. It was meant to keep us exactly where we were, heads down and breathing shallow, until the last rotor was over the hills and the people who mattered to themselves were safely away. I'm going to be honest about what I felt, because if I pretend I was calm, I'd be lying to you. And these stories aren't worth anything if they're lies. What I felt was a cold, specific anger. The kind that doesn't make your hands shake but makes them very steady. The kind that narrows everything down to a fine, bright point. I'd given the Navy 2 decades. I'd given it both my knees and most of my hearing in the high frequencies, where a wife's voice and a child's laugh happened to live, and a good piece of my lower back, and a marriage that couldn't survive the deployments. And I'd given it gladly, because I believed in the thing it was supposed to be. And the institution I'd given all that to had just looked at the math, at the helicopters and the seats and the number of people worth saving, and crossed me off without a word. Crossed Diaz off, this steady kid with the almond orchards and the Dairy Queen. Crossed off 1,100 kids who'd raised their right hands, believing the chain went both directions, believing that if they took care of the Navy would take care of them. But anger doesn't keep you alive. Information does. And the information I had was thin and ugly. I knew the brass were leaving. I knew the chem alarm was fake. I did not know why. I didn't know what they were running from that was bad enough to abandon a whole base of trained sailors, but not bad enough to announce. Bad enough to fake an alarm over, but not bad enough to risk a single seat on a helicopter to save anyone below an 06. And until I knew that, every decision I made was a guess. And I've never liked making decisions in the dark. My whole trade is the opposite of guessing. You take readings, you check pressures and temperatures, you find the fault before you touch the wrench. We need to get to base ops, I told Diaz. Not the phone, the building. Somebody triggered that override by hand, which means somebody's still in there, or was a few minutes ago. And I want to know what they saw before they decided to flush the rest of us. It was a 30-minute walk inland from the waterfront, or 10 minutes if we could get a vehicle. And the IMF had a flatbed forklift and an old pickup the shop used for hauling parts between buildings. A beat-up gray thing with 250,000 miles on it, and a clutch that needed 2 feet and a prayer. The pickup it was. We took the keys off the board by the personnel door and went out into the night. And the cold off the bay hit me the way it always did. Salt and diesel and seaweed and something underneath all of it that I didn't have a name for yet. A faint sourness on the wind that I noticed and filed away and didn't understand. The temperature had dropped. My breath showed in the headlights when I keyed the truck to life. The waterfront was emptier than it had been 10 minutes earlier. Some of the duty sections had drifted back toward their ships, taking shelter inside the skin of steel they trusted, climbing back up the brows into the lit interiors, exactly the way the alarm wanted them to. Because a chemical alarm tells you to get inside and seal up, and that is precisely what good training makes you do. Others had clustered around the quarterdeck of the closest destroyer, where I could see a young officer standing on the brow with a flashlight and a watch bill, trying to impose order on a situation that had already left the rails and gone end over end down the embankment. I almost drove past him. I want you to understand that, because I've turned it over many times since. The smart, selfish thing, the thing the brass had done, was to put my head down, find out what I needed to know, look after myself and the one good sailor sitting beside me, and let the rest of it sort itself out. That's how you survive. That's the math the helicopters were doing. But the kid on the brow caught my headlights and stepped forward into them with his hand raised, his shadow thrown long across the pier. And I stopped because 19 years builds something into a man that's hard to override with one bad night. And because the kid had stepped toward the truck instead of away from it. And that small detail mattered to me more than I could have said. His name tape read Okonkwo, and the single gold bar on his collar told me he was an ensign, which meant he'd been an officer for about 10 months and had probably never had a worse night in his life, would probably never have a worse one again. He came up to the driver's window with his flashlight pointed at the deck so as not to blind me, which was a small courtesy that told me something about him, and gripped the door frame with a hand that wasn't quite steady. "Chief," he said, reading the IMF patch on my coveralls. "You're maintenance, right? You've got comms over there. You've got the direct lines. What's the actual situation?" My CO went to the helicopters. My XO went to the helicopters. I watched them go. The senior officer I can find on the entire waterfront is a lieutenant junior grade who locked herself in the wardroom and won't answer the door. I've got 200 people on this pier asking me what to do. And I don't have one true thing to tell them, not one. I looked at this kid, 23 years old maybe, with a soft face that hadn't grown into itself yet, holding a flashlight and a clipboard against the collapse of everything he'd been taught to rely on. And I made the first real decision of the night. I could have lied to him, kept him calm, kept him useful and ignorant, the way the loudspeaker wanted all of us. A lie would have been easier. A lie would have let me drive away, with him still believing help was coming. Instead, I told him the truth. Because the truth was the only currency that was going to be worth anything before morning. And because the boy had asked me for one true thing. And a man should give a thing like that when it's asked for honestly. The chem alarm's fake, I said. There's no gas. The detectors all read clean. Somebody in headquarters faked it to keep the waterfront frozen and breathing shallow while the brass cleared out. Those helicopters aren't coming back for us, Ensign. I don't know why yet. I'm going to base ops right now to find out. But you've got 200 people, and here's what you do with them. Don't send them back inside the ships, and don't let them scatter inland. Keep them together. Keep them out here on the open pier, where they can see what's coming from any direction and account for every single one of them by name. Can you do that? He went pale, the color draining out of his face under the orange light, so that he looked almost gray. And then he went very still. And then something in him hardened into the thing that makes a few young officers worth following and leaves the rest of them clutching clipboards their whole careers. Yes, Chief, he said, and his voice came out steadier than I expected. What do I tell them? They're going to ask me why help isn't coming. They're going to ask me what's happening. Tell them the truth, I said. Tell them help isn't coming, and we're going to figure this out ourselves. They'll trust you more for it than for any comfortable lie, and you're going to need that trust before the night's over. Don't dress it up. Don't promise them anything you can't deliver. Just tell them straight, and then give them something to do, because frightened people with a job stay frightened people. Frightened people with nothing to do become a mob. I put the truck back in gear, and the clutch shuddered. Account for everybody, Okonkwo, by name and by rate. We're going to need that list before this is over, and we're going to need it to be right. We drove inland with the windows down, both of them, because I wanted to hear the bass, and what I heard told me more than any phone call could have. The bass had a sound, always, day and night, year-round, a low industrial hum made of 100 generators and ventilation fans and seawater pumps and steam traps that ran around the clock, and that you stopped hearing within a week of arriving the way you stop hearing your own heartbeat. That sound was thinning. As we passed the barracks and the galley and the gym and the chapel, building after building had gone dark, and not the gentle dark of a power saver or a closed office. Hard dark, total dark. Somebody was shedding load, shutting down circuits in sequence, the way you'd safe a facility you didn't plan on coming back to, the way you'd put a plant to bed for a long, cold layup. The base wasn't just being abandoned. It was being put down, deliberately, system by system, by people who knew exactly which breakers to throw and in what order. And that methodical thoroughness frightened me worse than the helicopters had. The helicopters were panic. This was procedure. Somebody had a checklist. And then, as we came up the long slope toward the headquarters complex, the engine laboring in the truck's tired gears, the last helicopter lifted off the parade ground, and its searchlight stabbed down and swept once across the grass before the aircraft banked away inland and climbed In that one pass of hard white light, I saw the parade ground clearly for the first time that night. Saw the thing the darkness had been hiding from me. The detail that turned my anger into genuine fear and reframed everything I thought I understood about why the brass were running. The grass was covered in stretchers, dozens of them, laid out in neat rows the exact way they teach you to set up a casualty collection point, head to foot with lanes between for the litter bearers to walk. And every stretcher was occupied, and not one of the people on them was moving. Not a hand, not a head, nothing. The searchlight held on them for the length of a breath and then swung away, and the rows dropped back into black. But I'd seen them, and I couldn't unsee them. They'd had wounded, a lot of wounded, all gathered in one place, hours before the alarm ever sounded. Because you don't set up a collection point that size in 20 minutes. They'd treated it quietly, in the dark, out on the parade ground where the waterfront couldn't see what was happening, behind the screen of distance and night. And then they'd left the casualties behind too, every one of them, lying out in the cold grass while the last helicopter's wash flattened the blades of grass around them and lifted away. "Chief," Diaz said very quietly, and I realized I'd stopped the truck without meaning to, my foot hard on the brake. "Did you see those were stretchers? Those were people. I saw them." My voice came out rougher than I wanted. I made myself take my foot off the brake, made myself breathe, made my hands unclench from the wheel one finger at a time. We're still going to ops. Nothing's changed about that. But I need to know what put those people on those stretchers before I decide what we do about the 1,100 who can still walk. Whatever happened here, it happened before tonight. Tonight's just the part where they finally quit. Base operations was a low brick building set behind a chain-link fence topped with razor wire. The kind of perimeter that exists more out of habit than need. And the vehicle gate stood wide open. And that was the first wrong thing. Because that gate was never open, not in 11 months, not once. A petty officer of the watch sat in that gatehouse 24 hours a day and logged every car that passed. The gatehouse was empty now, the door hanging ajar, a clipboard still on the little shelf inside. The second wrong thing was the smell, which reached us before we reached the building's door, rolling out across the parking lot on that wrong wind. A sharp chemical sting laid over something sweet and thick and organic that I knew from a galley fire years back, where a man had been trapped against the deep fryers and didn't want a name now. Bleach over rot. Somebody had been cleaning something they couldn't fully clean, pouring chemicals over a thing that no amount of chemicals would ever wash away. The lights were on inside, running on emergency power. The corridors washed in that flat institutional white that makes you feel like you're already in a hospital or a morgue. We went in slow, Diaz at my shoulder. And on the way past a fire station mounted by the door, I picked up a 4-foot length of pipe from the rack, the kind of pry bar they keep for forcing valves. Not because I had any plan for it, but because my hands wanted something solid in them. And a man thinks more clearly when his hands aren't empty. The building was quiet in a way that buildings are never quiet. The deep silence of a place that emptied all at once. Coffee cups sat full and going cold on desks. A computer monitor glowed with a frozen login screen, the cursor blinking patiently in a box no one would ever fill. A flight jacket hung over the back of a rolling chair, name tape still sewn on. A commander's silver oak leaf on each shoulder, as if the man would be right back from the head. They hadn't packed. They hadn't gathered their things. They'd walked out between one breath and the next, the moment the word came down, and left their coffee steaming behind them. The operations center itself was at the end of the main corridor, behind a heavy door with a cipher lock. And the door stood propped open with a folded metal chair jammed under it, which is a thing you do when you don't want it to lock behind you. because you're leaving and not coming back. Inside, the big wall screens were still lit, glowing in the dim room. And that was where I finally got my answer. And I have wished 1,000 times since that I hadn't. The center screen showed a base map, the kind security used to track entry control points and roving patrols, the whole peninsula rendered in clean lines. Most of the base was shaded a calm, untroubled gray, but 3 areas were outlined in hard red, pulsing slightly the way an alarm state pulses on those displays. And I read the labels and felt the floor shift under me. The medical clinic, the brig, and the lower barracks complex. Over each red zone hung a label in the blunt, stripped-down language of an incident log. And the word that sat over all 3 was the same: containment. Below it, a casualty count that had clearly been updated by hand throughout the day. The numbers struck through and rewritten higher each time. 40 crossed out for 90, crossed out for 160, crossed out for a final figure of 217. And taped beside the keyboard on a sheet of printer paper, positioned so that whoever sat that watch could not possibly miss it. An order in plain block capitals: do not open clinic or brig. Do not attempt rescue of secured personnel. Waterfront to remain uninformed until evac complete. No exceptions. Diaz read it over my shoulder, his breath catching audibly. And then he asked the question I was already chewing on, the only question that mattered. Contained from what? 217 people contained from what? There was a logbook on the desk beside the keyboard. The green hardbound kind that every watch station keeps and signs and passes from one watch standard to the next. And somebody had been honest in it. The way people get honest when they're exhausted and frightened and certain nobody who matters will ever read what they write. I picked it up and turned to the last filled pages. And I read them aloud to Diaz in the empty glowing room, because saying the words out loud was the only way to make myself believe them. The first patients had come into the clinic 2 days before, brought over from the brig. 3 sailors who'd been thrown in confinement after a fight in the enlisted club had started running high fevers within hours of each other. And then, the log said, they'd started biting. The corpsman on duty had written that word plainly, biting, and beside it a careful clinical phrase: aggressive psychosis of unknown etiology, rapid onset, and then, a few lines down, where the clinical training had clearly failed him, he'd simply written, they don't stop, they don't feel it, you can't talk them down. The infirmary had filled within a day. The fever spread by bites, the log said, and by something else they couldn't pin down, something faster, because patients with no bites were turning too. They'd sealed the clinic when it got past them. Then they'd sealed the lower barracks when it jumped there. Somehow, through the ventilation maybe, or through a single infected sailor who'd gone back to his rack before anyone knew. The casualty count on the wall, 217, wasn't the dead. I understood that now. And the understanding was worse than the number. It was the contained. 217 living sailors, sealed behind doors that the order on the desk said no one was ever to open again, while the men who'd given that order climbed into helicopters and flew away into the dark. I set the logbook down very carefully on the desk, squared it up even, because if I'd held it any longer, I think I would have thrown it through the screen. And breaking the screen wouldn't have changed a word in it. The brass hadn't run from an attack. They hadn't run from an enemy across the water. They'd run from their own people. They'd had a containment problem they couldn't solve and a clock they couldn't beat. And somewhere in that operations center, somebody with rank had done the math. The same math the helicopters were doing. And decided that 1,100 clean sailors on the waterfront were an acceptable price against the certainty of getting the leadership out before the doors failed. The chem alarm kept us in place and breathing shallow. The dark kept us blind. The order on the desk made the silence official, turned abandonment into policy, gave it a paragraph number. 217 locked in, Diaz said, and his voice had gone hollow. And 1,100 outside who have no idea any of this exists. And the doors, I said, still looking at the screen. That the order says nobody opens. I was staring at the map, at the 3 red zones, and at one detail in their arrangement that turned my stomach slowly over. The clinic and the brig sat well inland, tucked back near the support buildings, away from the water and away from the only thing that mattered now. But the lower barracks complex, where most of the 217 were sealed, sat squarely between the waterfront and the causeway. The single road off Calder Point, the only land route to the mainland, ran directly past the lower barracks, close enough to throw a stone from the road to the doors. 1,100 people had exactly one way off this peninsula by land, and it ran straight past the worst place on the base. That was the moment the night stopped being about anger and became about a problem I actually had to solve. An engineering problem with human lives as the variables. Because now I knew 3 things the brass had known when they made their choice. There was an infection, and it spread fast, and it didn't stop. It was behind doors that were holding for now. And the only land route off Calder Point ran past those doors, which meant that getting 1,100 people out the way they'd come in would take them straight past 217 infected, pressing against locks that were never designed, never engineered, never intended to hold back human beings trying that hard to get through them. I want you to sit in that for a second, the way I had to sit in it standing in that cold, glowing room. If you were there, knowing what I now knew, with 217 people sealed away that you could not safely free, and 1,100 more counting on a road that ran right past them, what would you do first? Where would you even start? Hold on to that, because the next hour didn't give me much time to weigh it. Diaz found the base public address controls on the operations console, a bank of switches and a gooseneck microphone. And for a long moment, I stood there and seriously considered grabbing that microphone and telling the entire base the whole truth in one broadcast. Getting it all out at once, the alarm, and the helicopters, and the infection, and the doors. I didn't. And I want to explain why. 'Cause I know it looks cold from the outside, and maybe it was. 1,100 frightened people told all at once and over a loudspeaker that they'd been abandoned and that there were 200 infected between them and the only way out. Would not have organized. They would not have formed up and waited for instructions. They'd have panicked, the way any crowd panics. And they'd have run, in the dark, in every direction at once. And a good number of them would have run inland toward the causeway, looking for the road home, which was exactly the one direction they could not go uninformed, straight into the barracks complex. Truth without a plan attached to it is just a faster way to lose people. I needed a plan first, even a rough one, even half of one, before I gave them the truth. For the truth would kill more of them than the silence had. But I did do one thing in that room before we left, because there was one thing I could fix right then with my own 2 hands. I killed the chemical alarm. I found the manual override the brass had used to keep us frozen, a physical toggle switch under a clear plastic guard cover on the master annunciator panel, still flipped to the activated position. And I lifted the guard and snapped it off. All across the base, the recorded warble cut out mid-cycle, dying in the middle of its own rising note. And the silence that rushed in behind it was enormous, a physical thing, a pressure in the ears. For a moment, the whole peninsula held its breath. Then I keyed the PA microphone, just once, and I kept it simple and short, because Okonkwo wasn't the only young officer out there, clinging to a clipboard in the dark. And I wanted every one of them to hear a voice that sounded like it knew exactly what it was doing, even when it didn't. All hands. This is Chief Vance, IMF. The chemical alarm was false. There is no gas. I say again, there is no gas. The air is clean. Stand by your divisional officers and account for your people by name. Do not enter the clinic, the brig, or the lower barracks under any circumstances. Stay on the waterfront. Word is coming. Then I let go of the key, and the silence came back. And I hoped that the part about the lower barracks would do more good buried in there as a quiet instruction than the whole truth would have done, shouted as a warning. We drove back to the water faster than we'd come up, the old truck's headlights bouncing off dark buildings. And the base had changed again in the 20 minutes we'd been inside that room. Killing the alarm had let people start thinking again, and thinking had let them start moving. And now the waterfront below us was alive with purpose, instead of frozen with fear. Okonkwo had done what I'd asked, and a good deal more. He'd pulled the duty sections of all 3 ships into one consolidated formation on Pier 2, organized by ship and by department, ranks of sailors standing in the orange light. And he'd somehow extracted the lieutenant junior grade out of the wardroom by, as he later told me with the ghost of a grin, knocking on the door without stopping until she remembered she was an officer, and there were people who needed her to act like one. Her name was Bao, and she turned out to be a surface warfare officer with a full year at sea behind her, and a backbone that had only needed reminding it existed. I climbed up into the bed of a forklift parked at the head of the pier so that they could all see me, and I could see all of them. 1,100 faces turning up toward me in the orange light, and I gave them the truth at last, because now there was a shape to put it in, a plan forming even as I spoke. I told them about the override switch and the helicopters and the order taped to the desk. I told them about the infection in the clinic, and the brig and the lower barracks. And I told them the number, 217 sealed away. And I watched that number land across 1,100 faces, watched it ripple back through the crowd in a wave of stillness. And then I told them the part that mattered most, the part that turned a betrayed crowd into a crew with a job, which is the only thing that was ever going to keep them alive. The only road off Calder Point ran past the lower barracks, and we were not going to use it. Not the way it was, not yet, not tonight. A bosun's mate near the front, an older sailor named Ferris with 20-some years on him and gray in his mustache and a voice like a gravel truck downshifting, said what a lot of them were plainly thinking. "Chief, if the road's no good, then we're on an island. There's water on 3 sides and infected on the 4th. So what's the plan exactly? You want us to swim for it?" "No," I said. "We've got something a lot better than swimming. We're standing on it." And I turned and pointed past them at the 3 gray ships moored along the piers behind me, dark and enormous against the night sky. The destroyer at Pier 2, the frigate I'd been fixing at Pier 1, and the smaller, white-hulled cutter at the end of Pier 1. I'm past the frigate. 2 of those ships have engineering plants I can light off tonight. The frigate's down hard for the reduction gear I'm rebuilding in the shop, so she's out. But the destroyer's plant is intact, every bit of it, and so is the cutter's. We don't take the road. We take the bay. It is a strange thing to watch hope come back into people who'd spent the last hour believing they'd been left to die. It doesn't look like cheering, not at first. It looks like shoulders coming down off their ears, like breath being let out slow, like 100 small physical loosenings spreading through a crowd. But Lieutenant Bao, standing near the front with her arms crossed against the cold, was already shaking her head. And she was right to, because she'd spotted the flaw in it before the relief could even settle on the rest of them. "Chief, Those are warships. To get one underway, you need a real crew, a qualified crew. We've got 3 duty sections, maybe a third of full complement between them, and half of those are deck and weapons rates, not engineers. You cannot drive a destroyer off a pier with 150 people who mostly aren't qualified to stand the watch. We'd ground her in the channel, or worse. You're right, I said, and I'm not going to. I don't need to drive it anywhere. I need it to float, make power, and hold 1,100 people for one night while we work out the causeway in daylight. A pier-side ship with the plant running and the lines doubled is the single safest place on this base. It's steel. It's defensible. It's got water and food and a sick bay and racks for the injured. And nothing on this earth is climbing a doubled brow with a watch posted and a chain across it. We do not sail tonight. We fort up tonight. We let the destroyer be a fortress, and we solve the road tomorrow in daylight, with a real plan, on our own terms, instead of in the dark on theirs. That was the plan. It was a good plan. I believed in it completely for about 90 minutes, which is roughly how long it took the night to show me the one thing the brass had been thorough enough to do that I hadn't yet imagined. We got organized the way sailors do when you finally give them tasks instead of fear, which is to say fast and well. And with that grim competence that the Navy beats into people whether they want it or not, I sent Ferris and the strongest deck divisions to double up all the mooring lines on the destroyer and rig the 2 brows for defense. Because a single narrow brow with a chain stretched across it and 2 big sailors standing behind the chain is a choke point that a handful of people can hold against a crowd of any size. I took Diaz and 4 machinists' mates down into the destroyer's main engineering spaces to start lighting off the plant, which is a long, careful, sequenced process of bringing fuel oil service pumps and lube oil pumps and seawater cooling online in exactly the right order before you ever spin a turbine, and which I could have done blind with my hands alone after 19 years. Bao took accountability, and she turned Okonkwo's rough by-name muster into a real one. A proper count. 1,140 souls, including a scattering of civilian contractors and family members who'd been on base when it happened. And she started moving them aboard the destroyer and the cutter in an orderly stream. The sick and the injured and the children first. And there were injured, plenty of them. More than I'd realized in the dark. People hurt in the first crush of panic. A sprained ankle, a broken wrist from a fall down a ladder. A chief who'd had some kind of cardiac event when the alarm went and was being kept quiet and flat on a stretcher by 2 corpsmen who'd appeared out of the duty sections. A civilian woman, heavily pregnant, who'd been working late in a contracts office in the same building I'd come from and who walked up the brow with one hand under her belly and her jaw set hard. Real people with real faces and real names, who an hour earlier had been reduced to a line item by men in clean-pressed uniforms climbing into helicopters, written off in a calculation they never knew was being made. Down in the engineering spaces, with my hands on machines I understood completely and trusted absolutely, I started, for the first time all night, to feel something close to control returning. The space was hot and loud and smelled of fuel and hot oil and the particular metallic tang of a warship's guts. And it was the most familiar smell in the world to me. The smell of competence, of problems that had answers. The gas turbines spun up one after another, with that long rising whine that climbs and climbs until it passes out of the range of your hearing. The generators picked up the electrical load with a solid thunk through the deck. And the destroyer came alive around us, lights steadying and brightening, ventilation fans kicking in with a rush of moving air, the great gray body of the ship turning back from a dead hull into a living, breathing, working thing. Diaz grinned at me across the engineering control console, sweat already on his face from the heat. The first time either of us had smiled since the alarms went. And he said, "We're going to make it, Chief. We're actually going to make it." And that was the exact moment the sound machine in my head, the one that 19 years had built piece by piece, the one I trust above my own eyes, told me that something was badly wrong. Because underneath the climbing turbines and the running generators and the rush of the ventilation, layered in beneath all the sounds that were supposed to be there, I could hear water. Not bilge water sloshing in the normal way. Not the harbor slapping against the hull outside. A heavy, steady, rushing sound. The unmistakable sound of seawater moving fast and in volume, coming from somewhere low and aft. The sound of the sea going somewhere the sea was never supposed to be. I left Diaz on the throttles and went aft along the lower-level passageway at something close to a run, ducking under cable runs and stepping over knee knockers. And the wrong sound got louder with every frame I passed. And then the deck plates under my boots were wet, water seeping up between the gratings, and then I came around the corner into the after engine room, and the deck wasn't wet anymore. It was flooding, a steady black sheet of bay water already spreading across the lower gratings and climbing, with the cold, raw smell of the harbor rising off it. I splashed in and found the source in 3 seconds because I knew exactly where to look. The main seawater injection valve, the big bronze gate valve that lets the sea into the ship's cooling system, the one valve in any engineering space that opens directly to the ocean, was cranked fully open. Its big handwheel spun all the way out, and the handwheel had been chained in that open position. And the chain was secured with a heavy padlock so it couldn't be spun back shut. And on the deck beside it, weighted down with a combination wrench so it wouldn't float away as the water rose, was a laminated card printed in the same blunt block capitals I'd seen on the desk at base ops. Vessels scuttled per containment order. Do not attempt to restore. Contagion suspected aboard. Diaz had come up behind me, drawn by the same sound, and he read it over my shoulder and went absolutely silent. Then he asked the question I was already grinding through, the one that mattered. Contaminated from what? There's nobody aboard. We just lit her off. Why would they scuttle a ship that was empty? But I understood, and the understanding came down on me like a weight. They'd thought of the ships. Of course they had. They were professionals, the people who'd planned this, and somewhere among them was someone who'd been a sailor long enough to know exactly how 1,100 abandoned sailors would think. Because it was how he thought too. They'd known that if you left 1,000 sea-trained people on a pier next to floating warships, the very first thing those people would do is look at the gray steel and see salvation, see a fortress, see a way out. So before they boarded their helicopters, somebody had gone down into the guts of every ship that could float, found the one valve that opens to the sea, opened it all the way, chained it, locked the chain, and left a card so that when the inevitable engineer came down here, he would understand exactly what had been done to him. The destroyer wasn't a fortress. It was a trap. And I had just spent the last 45 minutes marching 400 people aboard it. I stood there in the rising water, the cold of it already biting through my boots, doing the arithmetic of a thing I'd practiced 100 times in damage control drills and never once done for real with lives in the balance. Flooding rate, judging by the sound and the spread. Volume of the compartment. Time before the water topped the lower level and started down the passageways into the next space. And then the space after that. The way flooding cascades through a ship that's lost a major compartment. Maybe 40 minutes before this ship took on a serious list at the pier. An hour, 90 minutes at the outside, before she settled hard enough against her own mooring lines that she'd roll. And a destroyer rolling against a pier with 400 panicking people trapped below decks does not bear thinking about. and between me and the valve that would stop all of it was a padlocked chain that I had no key for. Diaz was already in the water beside me, having heard everything, and come aft toward the problem instead of away from it, which is the single most important thing I can tell you about the kind of man he was. I got on the sound-powered phone to the bridge, to bow, and I made myself keep my voice flat and level, because 400 people aboard this ship were about to take their emotional cue from however I sounded in the next 10 seconds, and panic travels faster than water. Lieutenant, this is Vance. Stop the embarkation. Stop it right now and reverse it. I need everyone off the destroyer, back down onto the pier, calm and orderly. Injured and children first, the same careful way they came aboard. This ship is flooding aft. Somebody opened her to the sea on purpose, and I can't promise I can stop it in time. Move everybody to the cutter and the open pier, not the frigate, the cutter. Go now. To her enormous and lasting credit, she didn't argue, and she didn't waste a second. I heard her voice come up over the ship's general announcing system a moment later, flat and certain and unhurried, turning a river of 1,100 frightened people around without setting off a stampede. And that is harder than fighting the flood. While she did that, I went to work on the chain with the only tools I had within reach, which were the 4-foot pipe still in my hand and a fire axe off a bulkhead bracket. The padlock was hardened steel. The chain was hardened steel, good thick links. Whoever had done this had used quality gear, because they'd been a sailor too, and they'd known precisely what another sailor would try when he found it, and they'd made sure he'd fail. Together, Diaz and I got the axe head jammed into one link and levered against it with the pipe for a cheater bar, both of us throwing our full weight down on it, again and again, while the water climbed past our knees and then up our thighs, so cold it took the breath out of you. And I will be straight with you. I did not think it was going to give. I thought I was going to have to make the call to abandon the destroyer and pray the cutter at the end of the pier hadn't gotten the same treatment, that there was at least one hull left under us that would float. But on maybe the 8th or 9th heave, with both of us grunting and the axe handle bending, the link sheared with a crack like a gunshot, and the chain came free and slithered off the hand wheel into the dark water. And I spun that great bronze wheel shut against the full pressure of the sea behind it, Diaz adding his weight to mine on the spokes, the two of us hauling it around inch by inch until the rushing sound choked off and died, and the only water left in the space was the water already in it. I'd saved the destroyer, but I'd also just learned, all the way down to the bone, the lesson the night was teaching me. And I made myself learn it completely instead of just feeling the relief. Every ship on those piers had been scuttled by people who knew exactly how to do it and exactly how to make it stick. And the only reason this one was still afloat was that I'd happened to be standing in her engine room and caught it in the first 40 minutes. The cutter at the end of Pier 1 had been making her own power for over an hour by then. If she'd been opened the same way, she was already gone. I sent Diaz running for the cutter while I stayed with the destroyer's plant, lining up the adductors to dewater the after engine room, nursing a wounded ship that still wanted to sink under my feet. And while I worked alone in that flooded steel space, ankle deep in the water that was left, I finally let myself understand the full shape of what the brass had done. And it was worse than abandonment. Worse by an order I hadn't grasped until that moment. Abandonment is passive. You leave people and you let circumstance and bad luck do the killing. And you tell yourself afterward that you didn't actually kill anyone. But this was not passive. This was active. They had walked the entire base before they left and methodically closed every door, sealed every exit, scuttled every hull, faked the one alarm that would hold us in place, and put the silence in writing as a command, so that the 1,100 people they left behind would not merely be unsaved, but rendered unable to save themselves. They hadn't left us to die. That phrase is too gentle. They had built us a tomb, sealed it carefully from the inside, and flown away from it. Diaz's voice came back over the sound-powered phone about 20 minutes later, and it was flat and grim in a way I'd never heard from him. The cutter was gone. Same valve, same chain, same padlock, same laminated card. But nobody had been in her engineering space to hear the water start. And she'd been flooding unattended for over an hour. And now she was down hard by the stern, with water over her lower levels, listing against her lines, settling. 40 people had been aboard her when it started. Diaz had gotten 36 of them up the ladders and off. The other 4 had been below, in the after spaces, in compartments that were already full of black water by the time anyone understood what was happening. And there was no getting down to them. No way. The ladders already underwater, for 4 names. I made myself stop and register that there were 4 names, 4 actual people, because the brass had spent the whole night reducing 1,100 human beings to figures on a wall. And somewhere in the long, cold dark of that engine room, I had decided that I was not going to do the same thing. I was not going to let them become a number. 4 sailors had drowned at the pier of a naval base in their own country. In the dark, in water their own leadership had deliberately let into the hull. And the men responsible for it were safe inland by now, or would be within the hour, sleeping or filing reports. So here is where it all stood, a little past 2 in the morning. 1 ship saved, barely, holding 1,100 people, but flooded aft and going nowhere under her own power ever again. 1 ship sunk at the pier with 4 dead inside her. 1 frigate torn open in her own engine room for my reduction gear job, useless to anyone. The brass gone, every one of them, over the hills. The base going dark and cold around us, system after system shutting down. And one more thing. The thing I'd been carefully not thinking about while I fought the flooding. The thing that had been sitting at the back of my skull since I read that logbook at base ops. The doors were holding, for now. But the log had said in plain language that the infection was spreading faster than they could contain it. And the order had implied the doors would not hold forever. And now the base was dark and cold and silent, with no power running the systems that might have helped. And 217 infected were pressing against locks in the lower barracks complex that sat directly between 1,100 survivors and the only land any of us could ever reach. The brass had run from those doors. They'd had a deadline I didn't know. A calculated moment when somebody had figured the locks and the hinges and the masonry anchors would finally give. And they had made very sure to be in the air and over the hills before that moment came. Which meant that somewhere out there in the dark, a clock I couldn't see and couldn't read was running down toward 0. And I had no idea at all how much time was left on it. I climbed up out of the engineering spaces around 2:30, soaked through to the chest, shaking with cold so hard my jaw rattled, and found Bao and Okonkwo and Ferris waiting for me on the destroyer's quarterdeck, gathered around a mess table somebody had dragged out and a base map spread across it under the white glare of a battle lantern. The mood had changed completely, and changed for the better in the strange way that disaster sometimes improves people. The relief from the engine room start was gone, burned clean off by the cutter sinking and the 4 dead. And in its place was something harder and more useful. The flat, steady look of people who have finally stopped waiting for somebody to rescue them and started planning to survive on their own. 1,100 souls were packed into the destroyer's berthing compartments and mess decks and passageways behind us, mostly kids, mostly scared, mostly quiet in that way frightened people get when they're trying hard to be brave. And these 4 standing at the table were what stood between all of them and the dark. "All right, Chief," Ferris said, leaning on the table with both fists, the gray in his mustache catching the lantern light. No road, no ships that can float free. Brass long gone. You said back there you had a plan. The first one nearly drowned 400 of us and put 4 good sailors on the bottom of the harbor. So I'll ask it plain. What's the second one? It was a fair shot, and I took it standing up because he was right, and the 4 dead were on my account as much as anyone's. The first plan was right except for the one thing they hid from me, I said. The destroyer's still the safest place on this base, flooded aft or not. She's steel. She's got power. She's got a choke point at the brow, and she'll hold 1,100 people for days if she has to. We're not leaving her tonight. We hold right here. We keep accountability tight. We feed people. We treat the injured. We post real watches at both brows. And we do not panic. The road we solve in daylight, with a plan, on our terms. I put my finger down on the map. On the lower barracks complex, the box that straddled the causeway road. But there's a piece of this I haven't told you yet, because I only just put it together myself, standing in that engine room. The brass didn't run from those doors because the doors were holding. They ran because they knew when the doors would stop holding. There's a clock on this thing, and we don't have the number. And we are not going to plan a single move until we do. Everything we decide depends on how much time those doors have left. And right now I'm guessing. And I've been guessing all night. And every time I've guessed tonight, it has nearly killed people. So I'm done guessing. We're going to go get the number. Nobody volunteered to talk me out of it, which is exactly how I knew they understood it had to be done. Diaz, of course, said flatly that he was coming, and I let him, because 2 sets of eyes and 1 man driving while the other watches is the entire difference between a reconnaissance and a funeral. Ferris pulled a handheld radio from the destroyer's damage control locker and pressed it on me with a spare battery. Bow handed me the cutter's salvaged battle lantern, its lens still beaded with harbor water. And Okonkwo, the boy who'd been clinging to a clipboard 6 hours earlier and was now running accountability for 1,100 people without his hands shaking, walked us down the brow himself and said the truest thing anyone said all that long night. "Chief," he said, gripping my forearm at the bottom of the brow. "They wrote us off on a wall, a red box on a map. Don't you go and do it too." I told him I wouldn't, and I meant it more than I'd meant anything in years. And Diaz and I climbed into the old IMF pickup and drove inland into the dark, toward the doors the brass had run from. The base at 3 in the morning was a dead thing, a corpse of a place. Every building black, every street light out, the only light in the whole world, the moon laying a cold silver track across the bay behind us, and the truck's own headlights punching a narrow tunnel ahead. I drove slow, both windows down, listening hard. And the closer we got to the lower barracks complex, the more I could hear it over the engine. A sound I will carry with me until the day I die. A low, continuous, rhythmic pounding, hundreds of fists and shoulders and bodies hammering against steel doors, slow and tireless and horribly patient. Rolling out of the dark ahead of us, like the heartbeat of something enormous and wrong, buried under the ground. We killed the headlights 100 yards short and rolled the last of the way in neutral, coasting to a stop in the deep shadow of the galley building. And I put the battle lantern up over the dash and onto the complex and looked, for the first time, at the doors the order said no living person was ever to open. 3 sets of heavy double steel doors, the main entrances to the lower barracks, and every one of them was bulging. Not failed, not yet, but dished visibly outward, the heavy gauge steel deformed and bowed, where 200 bodies had been throwing themselves against the inside of them for 2 days without rest. Around the frame of the center set, I could see the masonry cracking in the lantern beam. Fine pale lines of fracture spidering out into the wall from the points where the door anchors were embedded. And as I watched, a small piece of mortar came loose and fell. They were going. Not in days, the way I'd let myself half hope on the drive out. Looking at those bulging doors in the hard white light, with the pounding coming through the cold air and the crack of breaking masonry, I understood the number the brass had known. Hours, maybe by dawn. And when those doors went, 217 infected would come pouring out into the dark, directly across the one road off Calder Point, between 1,100 survivors and the rest of the living world. "Chief," Diaz breathed beside me, so low I barely caught it. "There's something else. Drop the light down. Look at the road." I lowered the lantern beam from the doors down to the causeway road that ran past them, and I saw it. And it changed the plan for the third and final time that night. The road wasn't empty. It was blocked. There were vehicles strung across it, abandoned. A whole line of them parked deliberately nose to tail from one side of the causeway to the other. The base security trucks and the two big fire engines and the white medical vans. Every emergency vehicle on the peninsula. And in the lantern light, I could see they'd been chained together, bumper to bumper, locked into a single immovable mass. And I understood that the brass had done one last thing on their way out the door, one final thorough thing. They hadn't only scuttled the ships and faked the alarm and sealed the barracks. They had barricaded the causeway deliberately, with the base's own emergency vehicles, welded and chained into a wall across the only land bridge, to make absolutely certain that when the doors finally gave way, the infected could not follow the road across the marsh to the mainland. They had turned the whole of Calder Point into a sealed box, and they had left us inside it. We weren't simply abandoned. We were the seal. We were the cork they'd left jammed in the neck of the bottle to make sure that nothing, living or infected, got off that peninsula. And the doors that were going to kill us were also the only thing standing between 217 infected and that same barricade they'd be thrown against. I sat there in the dark with the lantern hot in my hand and the pounding filling my ears, and I finally understood the whole machine, every gear and linkage of it. And the cold completeness of its cruelty was so total that I found myself, against my own will, almost respecting the mind that had designed it, even as everything in me hated it. They had thought of everything a man who thinks in roads and helicopters and barricades would think of. Then I switched the lantern off, because I'd seen more than enough, more than I'd wanted. And I sat in the dark and started running the only math that still mattered. 1,136 living people. A flooded destroyer that could float but never sail. A barricaded road we could not use. A set of doors that would fail by dawn and vomit 200 infected onto the only ground we'd ever have to cross to leave. And a bay full of cold black water that was, I realized, all at once, with a jolt that straightened my spine against the seat, the only door on the entire base that the brass had not thought to lock. Because here's the thing they got wrong, the one single thing, and I want you to think hard about whether you would have seen it before I tell you. They were leadership. They thought in the ways that leaders move, in roads and aircraft and convoys and barricades, in all the ways a person leaves a place by land or by air. But I was a snipe, an engineer, a man who had spent 19 years of his life thinking about nothing but water and hulls and pressure and what floats and what sinks and why. The brass had scuttled the destroyer and the cutter to keep us from sailing away across the bay. But a ship is not the only thing that floats. And a pier-side base, whose entire purpose is the maintenance of ships, keeps an enormous amount of equipment lying around for the moving of heavy things across water. Camels, the big floating fenders, sections of floating dry dock. And down at the IMF, where I worked every day, tied up along the inboard quay wall, 2 big steel work barges, flat-decked pontoon barges that we used as floating platforms for hull work alongside the ships. Each one easily large enough to hold 300 people standing, and neither one of them with a single sea valve to open. Because a barge has no engine and no cooling system and nothing to open to the sea. A barge floats on sealed buoyancy tanks and nothing else. They could not be scuttled the way the ships had been. And with the destroyer's engineering plant running, I had the electrical power and the pumps and the line handling gear and the lighting I needed to move them. The brass had locked every door but the water. And I was the one man left alive on that whole dark peninsula who had spent his entire life thinking about the water. I drove us back to the pier faster than I had any right to on that dark road. And I laid the whole thing out for Bao and Ferris and Okonkwo on the mess table, the door's deadline hanging over every word of it. We could not sail the destroyer. No crew, no time after spaces flooded. We did not need to. The bay was a little under 2 miles wide where it separated Calder Point from the fishing town of Marrow Cove. And across that 2 miles of flat, cold black water, dark and quiet, and outside the brass's sealed box, was a town with working docks and roads and people, a town that was not part of the trap. 2 miles of water between us and the rest of the world, and 2 steel barges down at the IMF that could carry 600 people at a crossing if we packed them shoulder to shoulder, towed across by the base's harbor tug, which sat alongside Pier 3 and which I would have staked my life on it. The brass had never thought to scuttle, because the tug wasn't a warship, didn't carry weapons, didn't appear anywhere on whatever list of important hulls they'd worked their way down. 2 trips, Bao said immediately, working it through out loud, her finger tracing the route across the map. 600 a trip, 2 trips, that clears the whole base. How long for one crossing? The tug will make maybe 6 knots towing 2 loaded barges, maybe a little less, I said. 2 miles out, offload at Marrow Cove, 2 miles back light, load again, second crossing out. Call it 3 hours, start to finish, for both runs, if absolutely nothing goes wrong. I looked down at the map, at the red box, at the bulging doors I'd just seen with my own eyes an hour before. And the doors give by dawn. Civil dawn's at 0540 this time of year. It's 0315 now. So we have maybe 2.5 hours before 200 infected come out into the open. And here's the part that makes it ugly. The IMF, where the barges are, is inboard of the lower barracks complex. To get the barges from the IMF quay out to where the tug can take them in tow, we have to bring them right past those doors. The way out runs straight past the thing that kills us. The little group around the table went silent, because everyone there now understood the exact shape of it. The way off the peninsula ran past the thing that would kill us. On a clock we could not stop or even see clearly. And the only question left in the whole world was whether we could move fast enough to get the barges clear of those doors before the doors gave. Get them clear in time. And 1,100 people would live to see the sun come up over Marrow Cove, move too slow by even a few minutes, and the doors would open onto a stretch of waterway crowded with helpless people packed onto open steel decks with nowhere to run and nothing to fight with. If you had been standing at that mess table, knowing the doors would give by dawn, knowing the only safe steel fortress you had was already flooding, and might not last the night either, would you have run for the water, or would you have held the destroyer and prayed the locks held one more day? I made my choice, and I'll tell it to you straight. but I have never once been certain it was the right one. And I think about it still most nights. I chose the water. I chose it because the destroyer was only safe for exactly as long as the doors held, and I had seen the doors with my own eyes, and they were not going to hold. And once 200 infected were loose and roaming a dark island, a flooded ship at a pier was nothing but a slower tomb with a better view. The brass had bet everything on the doors, holding just long enough for them to escape, and then failing in a way that would seal the island behind them. I bet the opposite way. I bet that the one thing they had not locked was the one thing I knew better than any man alive on that base, and that I could get 1,100 people across 2 miles of black water before a set of dished steel doors finished tearing itself out of a cracking masonry wall. We moved. God, how we moved. Ferris took the deck divisions and ran for the harbor tug at Pier 3. And the old tug lit off her diesels on the second try, coughing and then rumbling to life, exactly as I'd prayed she would. A tired, unglamorous workhorse that nobody important had thought to kill. Diaz and I took a team and broke the 2 barges loose from their moorings at the IMF Quay. And the work of it was brutal and frozen and fast. Casting off lines stiff with cold, rigging tow bridles in the dark by the light of battle lanterns. While up on the piers, bow staged 1,100 people by section, ready to move. She ran that embarkation with a discipline that would have made a fleet admiral weep. The injured and the pregnant woman and the sick chief first, then the youngest sailors, then everyone else with no regard at all for rank. No pulling of seniority, no shoving, no panic. Just a long, quiet river of frightened people, walking down onto cold steel decks in the dark because a chief and a lieutenant and an ensign and a gray-mustached boatswain's mate had decided, together, not to write a single one of them off. The tug took the first 2 loaded barges in tow at 4 a.m. sharp. 600 people packed shoulder to shoulder standing on the open decks, no rails to speak of, nothing between them and the black water but their own balance and the press of the bodies around them. The route ran inboard of the lower barracks complex because there was simply no other channel deep enough to float the loaded barges, no other way out. We crept past those doors at 3 knots with every light on the barges doused to nothing. 600 people standing in absolute dead silence on open steel. And through the cold, still air came the pounding, much closer now, faster than before. And as we drew abreast of the doors, the rhythm of it broke apart into something frenzied and eager. And I knew with a cold certainty that the things behind the steel had heard us, or smelled us, or simply sensed the nearness of 600 living bodies. Because the pounding rose into a sound I can only describe as hunger given a fist. Ferris pushed the tug as hard as she would go, without parting the tow lines and capsizing us all. And we slid past those bulging doors with the masonry visibly cracking and shedding in the moonlight. And I stood at the bow of the lead barge with the 4-foot pipe still gripped in both my hands, useless against what was behind those doors. And I counted 600 breaths held as one single breath. We cleared the complex. The barges swung out past the last of the buildings into the open bay, the tug's wake catching the moonlight, the lights of Marrow Cove glittering low and warm and unbelievably far across the black water ahead. And as the pounding fell away behind us into the dark, 600 people let out that one-held breath together. A long, ragged exhalation I felt more than heard. I rode the first crossing myself, because I needed to see Marrow Cove with my own eyes. Needed to know with certainty that the way out was real, and not just one more locked door waiting at the end of it. And it was real. There were fishermen on the docks, men in coveralls and rubber boots, who'd watched the great base across the water go dark building by building over the last hours, who'd heard the dead alarm cut off mid-note and seen no lights and got no answer on any radio channel they tried. And they took our 600 off the barges and started running them up the road into the town and toward the mainland before the barges had even finished bumping alongside. The tug turned back for the second crossing at 5 in the morning, running light and fast now. And that was when the doors finally gave. I was aboard the tug for the return run, standing in the cramped, warm wheelhouse beside Ferris with his hands on the wheel, when the sound reached us across the open water. And it was not the patient pounding anymore. It was a single, enormous, tearing crash, the sound of steel and masonry letting go all at once, and then a low, rolling roar. And behind us, far back across the dark bay, the lower barracks complex finally surrendered. We never saw them clearly, thank God. Only movement in the dark where there had been none. A spilling and a churning of shapes out of the broken doorways and onto the causeway road, where they struck the brass's own barricade of chained vehicles and could go no further, exactly and precisely as the brass had designed it. Except that the brass had meant for us to still be on the wrong side of that wall when it happened. The infected came boiling out into a sealed box, and the box was empty now of everyone but the last 500, who were standing in ranks on the IMF quay, waiting their turn for the tug, with maybe 40 minutes before the things found their way around the complex and down to the water's edge. That last crossing was the longest 40 minutes of my entire life. And I've had some long ones. We loaded 500 people onto the 2 barges in 15 minutes, which should be flatly impossible and somehow is not, when the only alternative is the thing coming down the quay behind you. Bao was the last living soul off the base, walking the length of the dark quay with her battle lantern held high, checking every shadow and every compartment to be dead certain no one had been left behind, no one forgotten, no one made into a number. And she came up the last barge ramp at a dead run, with the first of the infected already visible at the inboard end of the IMF, drawn out of the dark by the noise and the lights, moving in that terrible, tireless, lurching way the corpsman's log had tried and failed to find words for. Ferris had the tow lines off the bollards and the tug already pulling before her boots hit the steel. And we drew slowly away from the quay, into the black water, with the infected reaching its very edge behind us, stopping short at the line where the concrete met the sea as if the water were a solid wall, which, for them it was, because the brass had locked every single door but that one. And I had walked 1,100 living people straight out through it. We crossed the bay as the sun came up. That part I remember most clearly of all. More clearly than the flooding or the doors or any of it. The cold gray light spreading up over the hills behind the dead base. The 2 barges crowded with exhausted gray-faced survivors, all turned to watch their old home recede. The dark peninsula falling away behind us, with its broken doors and its scuttled ships, and its rows of stretchers still lying out on the parade ground that we had never been able to reach, never even tried to reach, that I will answer for somewhere someday. 1,136 people walked off those 2 barges onto the docks at Marrow Cove. 4 had drowned in the cutter in the dark. 217 were still on the island, behind a barricade the brass had built with their own hands to contain them. And the brass themselves were somewhere inland by then, safe, warm, with a report already drafted, I have no doubt, that explained in clean, careful language how containment had been successfully maintained and the leadership preserved, and an unfortunate but operationally acceptable loss, accepted at the lowest possible level. I never did find out the full truth of what put those first 3 sailors in that brig with a fever, or who knew what and when, or whether the order taped to that desk came from the base commander himself or from somewhere far higher up the chain. Some windowless room where the real math gets done about which people are worth the seats and which people are the cork. I gave my statement more than once to the serious, quiet people who came afterward in unmarked vehicles. And I told them every single thing I've just told you, and I watched a great deal of it get folded and pressed into language that made it quietly disappear. The cutter's 4 dead became a footnote about an industrial mishap during an evacuation. The barricade across the causeway became a successful containment perimeter, a thing to be commended. The 1100 became a number again, a number that had survived, and surviving made it terribly easy for everyone to stop asking how close that number had come to being a different one. But Okonkwo remembers. Lieutenant Bao remembers. Ferris and Diaz remember. And so do the 1136 who stood in dead silence on open steel in the dark and held their breath as one while we crept past those doors. And I remember the only thing the night ever really taught me, which is the one thing I have to give you at the end of all of this. The institutions we trust to come back for us are built out of people. And people do math. And when the math gets hard enough, they will sit down in a quiet room and decide, calmly, in clean-pressed uniforms, with no malice in their hearts at all, who is worth a seat on the aircraft and who is the cork they leave jammed in the bottle. The chain only runs in both directions for exactly as long as the people at the top of it decide that it does, and not 1 minute longer. They locked every door on Calder Point. They were thorough and they were intelligent, and most of them had been sailors once, so they thought of very nearly everything a person could think of. They simply forgot that the men they were leaving behind included one who had spent his entire life learning, in his hands and his bones, that water is not a wall. Water is a road. It always has been, for anyone patient enough and cold enough and stubborn enough to use it. We took the road they forgot to lock, and if you had been standing on that quay, with the doors about to give and the last helicopter already long over the hills, I would like to believe, I have to believe, that you would have found it too.